Hello, this is my book review for Translation and Revolution by Ramon Guillermo. So let's get started. This is, as I've said, Translation and Revolution by Ramon Guillermo, a study of Jose Rizal's Guillermo Tell. Who wrote it? Ramon Guillermo, a UPD Cal professor. What is it about? On the surface, it's about translation, obviously, right? It's about the translation of this story called Wilhelm Tell by or Wilhelm Tell because it's in German, by an author named Schiller. And then Rizal took that story, translated it into Tagalog, and then called that one Guillermo Tell. So it's a sort of analysis of that translation. But that's that at the surface. At the core, it's really about Rizal, right? So how he translated it, why he translated it in a way he did, and what are the ideological implications it has for sort of the revolutionary thought at the time. So that's what the book is all about. Let's talk about the contents of the book. The contents of the book, if I were to divide it, would probably be divided into 5 parts, right? So the very first part, we have chapter 1, the introduction. I highly suggest you read the whole book, but if you were only left with enough time to read 2 chapters, this would be one of those chapters. The next part, you have the cohesion part, coherence. So cohesion and coherence, they're very closely related. These are 4 chapters, 2 chapters each. And these sort of go into the nuts and bolts of analysis of translation and analysis of this translation in particular. These are a bit difficult to understand because they're a bit technical to translation. And as such, they may be a bit difficult to go through, right? I'm sure my classmates will attest to this, that coming into chapter 2, you might still have a little bit of optimism. Chapter 3 might wear you down a bit. Chapter 4, you'll probably get a bit tired. And by chapter 5, you're sort of just happy it's over. Because it's a bit difficult. It's really something you have to have that patience for. That next part, chapter 6, because this is 2, 3, 4, 5. This is chapter 6, the passing of nature. It's all about translating the word, the German word Natur, I guess, Natur, I don't know how to pronounce it, but then the German word for nature into Tagalog, the difficulties that presents and the implications it has on how Rizal did it. Again, earlier I mentioned that if you only had enough time for 2 chapters, you should read the introduction. The second chapter that I think you should read is this chapter, chapter 6 on the passing of nature, because it's a very interesting read and it really shows you Ramon Guillermo's writing style very well. The last part, is probably like how I would classify everything else that comes after chapter 6. So this is like the short conclusion, this is the appendix, this is the notes, the references. So yeah, those are the 5 parts that I would classify them as, and that's how I'm going to be going through my review, especially when I'm going to be dealing with my summary. Now, if you'll notice, this last part has an appendix that has a references part. So I'm not sure if this is like a undergraduate or master's thesis that they adapted into a book, but it seems to be that way. It's an academic study. Which is already my disclaimer for the rest of the book. And I'm not going to go into my review just yet, but this book sort of appeals to the academe. It's not a book you pick up off of the shelf. And speaking of picking it up off the shelf, it's not a book that you can find easily either. So 1, it's kind of hard to find, and 2, it's very hard to read. Very hard because I'm used to the usual self-help or novel or comic book, this is not an easy read. So with that being said, it's a very interesting read. If you do have the time and if you are interested in translation or in Jose Rizal's life, this is definitely something I should think you pick up. Again, it's a hard book to find because it was published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press. So if you want to get it, I got it from Ateneo. I got it from the bookstore, and it's a pretty funny story because I go there, I find this book, and I ask them, do you have any newer copies? Because if you look at my copy, it's quite old. There are marks, I guess it was water damaged. And then they said, on our database, that copy's not even supposed to be there. So I guess that's the last copy. So I picked it up for 470 pesos. Um, and since it's already an old book, I didn't feel that bad to be putting like notes and underlines and stuff because again, it's a hard book to read, so you might want to put notes if you ever you do read it to help you understand. Um, but yeah, just a disclaimer. So if ever you want to pick it up, just pick it up from the Ateneo de Manila University Press for 470 pesos. Um, that being said, let's get into the summary. Again, first part, right? Introduction. Introduction, one of the more interesting chapters. Let's begin with that very first sentence. That very first sentence grabs you at the start, where it says that Noli Me Tangere does not begin with Spanish. No, it begins with German. It begins with a language you definitely wouldn't have expected because it includes an excerpt of Schiller, right? It's Schiller. So who's this guy? Schiller. Schiller appears in Noli and El Fili. He's referenced in El Fili as this author, right? So or this poet, because I guess you can consider Wilhelm Tell more than a story as a play. So yeah, Schiller again is this writer, this guy who wrote the story of Wilhelm Tell. Now, I don't blame you if you've never heard of the story of Wilhelm Tell. Honestly, I wasn't aware of the story of Wilhelm Tell coming into this book, but I was aware of this tableau, and then the book mentions this also. That this Tom and Jerry scene of an apple on the head, right? Shooting an apple off of a person's head, that came from Wilhelm Tell. And if you're wondering how that came about, let me tell you about the story of Wilhelm Tell. So, Wilhelm Tell is a story of revolution. Um, Again, the apple on the head, that came from this story. So if you've ever seen that in mass media and in TV or in movies, that's where that started. Um, so it's a story about revolution. It's a story about these three communities called cantons, and they're called Uri, Schweiz, and Unterwalden. And then they rise up against Austria. This tyrannical leader from Austria, Gebler, Giebler. I don't know how to. I don't speak German, but Gebler, right? So he, in the town square, he puts his hat on a pole, and whenever people pass that hat, they have to kneel. So the story being Wilhelm Tell, obviously, let's just go to the story of Mr. Wilhelm Tell. He decides one day that he's not gonna kneel. He's not gonna kneel to Gebler's hat, and he gets caught. Being the badass he is, he gets caught and he gets punished. They say for his punishment, since he's a known marksman, they're going to give him, marksman being bow and arrow, they're going to give him a bow and an arrow, and he has to shoot it off of his son's head, right? So this is a bit more difficult than shooting with a gun, and even then it's difficult, right? Because there are high risks. Likely what's going to happen is he's going to end up killing his own son, which is going to be a horrible punishment for a guy who didn't kneel, right? But yeah, that's just sort of the story. So he pulls that string, lets it go, and miraculously he shoots the apple off of his son's head, and Gebler is definitely not pleased. So Gebler takes him, puts him on a ship, and sends him away, right, to be imprisoned, to be killed. But Wilhelm, our hero of the story, escapes. He waits, he hides, he ambushes Gebler and assassinates him. And that is what makes this a revolutionary story. It's all about revolution. But this story is such an iconic story because even in Nazi times, it was banned because people would read this story and try to assassinate Hitler. So this definitely shows the power that stories has, and this definitely shows the power that this story in particular has, right? So when we're asked the question of why Rizal would translate this book, on the surface, obviously on the surface level, it's probably because Pashano asked him, his brother asked him to, his older brother asked him to, so he did it. But the nationalistic view is that he did it because, and this is very important, I'm going to be referencing this later on, so I want you to remember this, that he wanted to take something that wasn't accessible to the masses, this story of Wilhelm Tell, which wasn't accessible to the masses, and put it in a form that they could understand, so that they could join in on this nationalistic dialogue, right? He wanted people to be able to join in on the conversation. So he made something accessible to them via translation, right? A secondary reason could be that it's a form of rebellion. Translating things to Tagalog is a form of rebellion against Spain, because Spain came to the Philippines to Christianize the community, right? To make them more like Mother Spain, but to make them more Filipino, and to make them give them more things to understand in Tagalog is not is definitely going against that mission of conversion. So how do we end this introduction, right? We end this introduction talking about translation, talking about Jose Rizal's translation in particular now. So let's get into it. How would you describe Jose Rizal's translation? How have people described Jose Rizal's translation? Well, translating is hard, first of all. Translating is hard, and when you translate something that's hard, you're usually left with two options, right? So your first option right here is when you're faced with something that you don't know how to translate, you borrow a word, right? So in Filipino, we have a lot of borrowed words that have their origins in English or in other languages, and then are spelled in Filipino. So C's become K's, and so on, right? So these are borrowed words. Another option for a difficult translation is form a new word in Tagalog. So let's say you have a word that doesn't have a direct translation, and it's a difficult thing to do, right? So you have to make a new word, right? So these were Rizal's options, but Rizal decided to make his own third option. His third option was he's gonna understand it, understand the source text, understand what the German, right? The German that can't be translated, and then find something else, understand the true meaning of it and find something else that corresponds to it, right? So he's not going to look for a direct translation. He's going to think about what it means overall and then translate that, right? So since it's not a direct translation, his translation could be categorized as a bad translation because it's not direct. Um, so But then he acknowledges this, right? Rizal acknowledges this, that it could be perceived as a freer translation, and he says this in a letter to his best friend Blumentritt. He writes this in a letter to Blumentritt. My translation is a little bit free, but I always tried to accurately translate the meaning, if not the word. That's what Rizal says in a letter to Blumentritt. And then this is explained because his process again is step one to to look at um, to look at the source text, and understand the meaning. Right. His next step was to flip it, find a corresponding phrase in Tagalog, and then the third step was to integrate this phrase into the rest of the translation to make it fit, so to say. Right. So those were his three steps. Um, Related to a bit of a free translation. And so when people read it, they sort of said it was a bad translation, right? They were like his own brother said, like he understands because you haven't spoken Tagalog in 4 years. So although it's grammatically correct, it's pretty hard to understand. And then Mariana Ponce, who helped him translate it, said it was too faithful to the German, so that you'd have to know the German to you have to like translate it back to German to be able to understand what you're trying to say, right? And that's not an effective translation. So he helped translate. But then, if these people are saying it's not a good translation, if Jose Rizal's friends himself at the time were saying it's not a good translation, then why would a guy like Ramon Guillermo write a 283-page book about just that one story, just that one translation? Well, it's because a freer translation gives you insight as to how people thought. That at least that's what I took from this book, right? That's what I feel Roman Guillermo was trying to say. That a freer translation gives you insight on Rizal and the ideological thought of the time. Um, so there, that's why we're studying this. So let's get into the meat of the book. The 4 chapters that are very difficult, and I'm sure my classmates will echo this in saying that it was a difficult book to read. As I've said before, it's a bit of an academic book. So yun, cohesion and coherence, the two related topics that are 4 chapters long and difficult to read, they kind of get into the nuts and bolts a bit too much for me. We'll get into more of that, more of why that is later. But then it's a bit difficult to understand, and bear with me because as much as I try to read it over and over again, I don't feel that I completely understood, and I feel like most people who read it don't completely understand it as well unless you're working in the field of translation. But here is what I understood. So the 2 parts. So after the introduction, we've got cohesion and coherence, right? So how are cohesion and coherence related, and how are they separate? So chapters 2 and 3, cohesion. This is the objective side of things, the objective side of how words are related, lexical, whatever, semantics. Coherence is more subjective, it's more meaningful, it's more, what is it really about? So why are we talking about an objective side? Why do we start with the objective? Well, the reality of translations is that they're hard to analyze. When you try to analyze, when you try to translate, right? Just as I've said earlier, some people have disagreements. Rizal thought his translation was a pretty good translation, but Pashano did not agree with him. So when you've got two people who disagree, right? How do you make an objective way of studying translations, right? How do you make an objective way of studying translation? How do you make an objective way of translating things? There are many methods that he I mean, not really many methods that he talks about, but then the one method he talks about is the Gerzimish Arbogast method. The Gerzimish Arbogast method. So basically, he says, with a lot of text, how do you analyze that quickly? In our day, it's easy to automate things. So, for example, I study economics. So, for me, I no longer have to make calculations on pen and paper. I have programs that do calculations for me, even in the most complex ones, right? So, how does a social science or how does a College of Arts and Letters professor automate analysis of translation? And he explains that pretty well. I mean, I got to understand quite a lot considering I don't really know anything about translation. So sort of like the method he used creates semantic networks, he calls them. Semantic networks being like sort of like you make an island, right? And that's like the meaning of the word, and you find these connectors, right? So these explicit connectors, there are 2 types of connectors, explicit and then the ones that are harder to find. So the ones that are explicit are automatically created by the computer, and then the other ones that are harder to find are done manually. And then there are problems to this, obviously, like what defines something that's explicit, and then how do you tell a computer to find something that's explicit? Because if you tell it how to find something that is explicit, that'll be a product of your own analysis. So that'll be, that won't be objective again. It'll be something that you had a hand in, right? So it's difficult, right? But then it is more objective than just looking at it, by yourself. Makes it faster also. It gives you a handy visualization of textual analysis, right? Of network clusters. It gives you all of these benefits, but then there are, of course, cons to it. And then how else do you analyze? There's the repetition of words, right? Collocation. So like that involves nosing collocates. Repetition of words is kind of difficult, right? So how do you, like, with longer text, it's easier to find repetition of words, but with shorter text, there are fewer words, so it's harder to find repetitions. And then with repetitions, you can only talk about repetitions of words, sentences, and phrases, but you can't really talk about more than that. You can't really talk about repetitions of ideas in paragraphs or in pages. So that's another problem. And then he gets into all of this in chapters 2 and 3. But I don't wanna get into that too much. So I mean, as much as I'd like to, I couldn't really understand a lot of it, to be honest. And I don't think that's my fault as the reader. I think that's also just sort of like I'm not the target market for this book, Anyway, so he later on goes into coherence, which is the more like less automated side, although he does use computer aided methods to help him analyze it. It's just more of the meaning now. So I'm not going to get into that either because there are these all hypaxographs and vocabulary flow graphs and repetition matrices and all that. So let's just go past that and go into now that I'm done with the introduction, cohesion and coherence. Let's go into the second chapter that I suggest you read if you only read 2 chapters, which is the passing of nature, right? It's all about the translation of one word, and I feel that this is really where Ramon Guillermo shows his writing prowess, right? This is where average Joes like me can really see what he's trying to say. But then, I feel like as a flaw of this book, the design doesn't exactly encourage you to get to that part. Those 4 chapters that precede it are a bit difficult to go through, right? So you're going through them a bit slowly, and then you get tired by the time that you reach that chapter. So, just as a word of warning, I hope you do read that chapter because it's a very interesting chapter. It's all about the translation of the word nature. So, if you're a Filipino today, you know that the word nature basically is kalikasan. But then in Rizal's time, that didn't exist yet, or at least it wasn't used in common language. So he used various other words, 6 to be exact. He used loob, meaning within or innermost being, pagkatao, meaning humanity, sang sinukuban, meaning universe, buhay, which is life, kinapal, which is creation, and lupa, which is land. So again, Rizal has this method of understanding things, the phrases, what they mean, and then finding a corresponding translation for that in particular, right? So it's so interesting. This is really so interesting because 6 words to describe one word. Like, let me give you an example, just to help you understand. So, gerakt hab ik die heli. I'm horrible at German, so I'm not gonna try anymore. But then, basically, word is nature, right? So he translates it to this. Ipinaghiganti ko ang santong loob ng may kapal na iyong sinira. So loob instead of nature. Okay. Let's look at nature in the humanity concept. Ang tunay niyang tanggulan ng pagkatao at ng katungkulan marangal. So pagkatao naman instead of nature. And that's so interesting that 2 words, within and humanity, that are so different, can be represented by the same word in German, but by different words in English and in Filipino, and in Tagalog, right? So, a more interesting way of understanding this is this thought experiment that this chapter talks about, right? This thought experiment says, let's get rid of all of the Wilhelm tells and leave only Rizal's Guillermo tell in the world, and people, when they read it, will not make the connection that these words, loob, pagkatao, sang sinukuban, these words will not be united in their nature-ness, right? So they won't be united in that sense, and people won't be able to understand it in that way. And that's a really interesting way of thinking. I think back to, for example, since I'm a Catholic, I think back to the Bible, and I think back to how that's an interesting translation that has been passed throughout years, and how maybe there are differences between, for example, the New American Bible and the King James Bible. And I saw, for example, that this article was talking about the difference between the word church and ecclesia, which is the word where the word came from, and how they're different because ecclesia means a gathering of people and churches can often refer to the building, right? So, I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but then that's just so interesting, right? Translation as a whole, it gives you a look into how that world works. If you've never been introduced to translation at all, this is a great real book that shows you what it's actually like. So that's why I enjoyed chapter 6 so much. The next chapter is just a conclusion, which is a very short conclusion, and then we go on into the appendix and the notes. So let me go on to my review of the book, right? So let me talk about this review. It's going to be a bit cheesy because I have 3 words that all begin with I to describe this book, right? These three adjectives to describe my experience with this book. So the first adjective is it's intelligent, right? It's intelligent because clearly it's very well thought out. There are no gaps in his logic as far as I can see. It makes perfect sense to me. Um, the motives that behind it, but I may not understand the method, and I honestly I may not understand all of the findings because I don't understand these graphs and figures and things. But it's still intelligent. It's still incredibly intelligent because difficult concepts were made easier by his book. Let me look for this this one figure that I particularly enjoyed. This figure refers to non-sociological translations to sociological translations and their corresponding, and sort of like an analogy between them and commodity exchange and barter exchange. How um, a sociological translation, by definition, like how you define a sociological translation, is kind of like commodity change, right? So you have a commodity, let's say a phone, and you want to exchange it for something, so you have to have money, right? So that's like the middle universal thing, right? Or labor. You have to create labor. So it passes through a process instead of barter change. Barter change says, okay, I want my phone. You give me another phone, right? That's barter change, and barter change is a non-sociological translation. One thing for another. Replacing one thing for another. While commodity change is like the sociological translation, the better translation, because it goes to the sort of universal thing, right? So yeah, um, that concept, I may have not done it justice, but that concept was definitely easier to understand because Ramon Guillermo is a very good writer. The second I word as after intelligent is innovative. So again, this it wasn't the story of Guillermo Tell wasn't considered the best translation, so it wasn't studied in depth, and Guillermo decides to study it. Guillermo decides to study it maybe because Guillermo isn't the name of the story, but then yeah, Guillermo decides to study it, um and then he uses innovative uh, approaches to analyzing it through computer aided analysis, right? So these are like groundbreaking thoughts and ideas done in groundbreaking methods to understand a topic that has great importance to us, especially today, right? But my last I word, although the first two I words were quite positive, my last I word is it's ironic. And let's go back to the very beginning of this review where I said that Rizal translated Wilhelm Tell to Guillermo Tell for one main reason, right? Jose Rizal said, I like the story of revolution. I like the story of revolution of Wilhelm Tell, and I feel that the Philippines will benefit from it, right? So I'm going to take this inaccessible story, this hard to understand story, and I'm going to make it accessible to the masses by translating it into Tagalog, right? So that's his purpose. And it's quite ironic that Ramon Guillermo read this and was like, all right, I'm going to make an academic paper. That's like, I mean, I understand. I understand that an academic study is important. But in the form of a book, maybe not that appropriate because you can make a study and submit it to journals. You can make a study and submit it to your professors. But to bind it as a book and sell it, I feel that it could have been made more accessible to more people, right? To the masses. This story is a bit academic, but there's a story in here that's not. There's a story in here that could have been made more, for the lack of a better word, fun, right? It could have been made more fun and easy to understand for the common person. And that's exactly what Jose Rizal was doing with the subject matter. The subject matter is Jose Rizal translating a difficult story in a difficult language to words people could understand. And I read this over and over and I did not understand all of it. So that's my it's my one it's my one negative thing about this, right? Like I brought books here to illustrate an example, my example, in a better way. So, um, if you've ever heard of behavioral economics, it's this new field in economics that's very interesting, and I love behavioral economics. I'm writing my thesis on behavioral economics, but I'm not going to publish my thesis, make another study and bind it into a book. Um, no, because I don't think that that's the point, right? My professors will appreciate my thesis, but my peers might not. So does that mean that behavioral economics does not belong on bookshelves in National Bookstore? Which again, you couldn't find this in National Bookstore because it's hard to one find and it's hard to two read. Anyway, so does that mean behavioral economics as a topic does not belong in National Bookstore? Well, that's not true. Because there are books like Freakonomics, which I'm sure you've heard of, and I mean, I read it so many times that it's so old. Predictably Irrational, another book about behavioral economics that I'm reading by a great author named Dan Ariely. Um, they bring this sort of academic concept and put into words people can understand, which is exactly something I feel that Rizal could be able to relate to. Uh, yeah, so you why not take this Ramon Guillermo book and put it in bite-sized pieces that people can actually understand, rather than in the academic place it is currently in. Um, that's my review of this book. I hope you enjoyed. Um, it was definitely a fun book to read, but then those four chapters again were very difficult. So, um, yeah, thank you.